She had been called thick her whole life. In Lagos, it was a compliment pressed into her grandmother's palms, warm and certain. You are built like the women who survive things. In London, it was a whisper behind cupped hands. Schoolgirls who thought cruelty was currency and spent it freely. In Seoul, it was silence. The particular silence of people who thought it, but hadn't yet decided if she was worth saying it to. She had learned to brace for all three. What she had never learned, what no version of the word had prepared her for, was a man like Ahn Manwol saying it like a prayer he hadn't meant to speak out loud. But that came later. First there was the elevator, the 43rd floor, the air that changed the moment the doors opened. Not temperature, not sound, something beneath both. A pressure that settled against her sternum like a hand pressing slow and deliberate, warning her before her mind caught up. VP Choi's memo had said floor 43, private executive, wing, report by 9 p.m. She'd read it 4 times on the subway, passing every word for the trap she could feel, but not yet name. His signature always looked like a threat dressed in good manners. The hallway was dim in the way that cost money. Polished stone floors that swallowed footsteps whole. No reception desk. No sound from behind any of the doors lining the corridor. No light underneath them either. The hallway felt like a held breath. She walked forward because standing still in a space like this was its own kind of answer. It had kept her employed for 14 months. She hoped it would keep her alive tonight. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly open. She heard voices before she reached it. Low, Korean. The cadence of men not discussing quarterly reports. She should have stopped. She pushed the door open. 3 men, 1 chair. 1 man in the chair who was not sitting by choice. Flora's hand stayed on the door. Her face stayed where she'd put it. Her body processed in sequence. Zip ties, blood at the corner of the seated man's mouth. 2 men flanking him who had already turned toward her. And then the 4th man, standing at the far window, back to the room. Dark suit, no tie, hands clasped behind him with the patience of someone who had learned that stillness was its own form of dominance. Looking at Seoul 43 floors below like the city owed him something, and he was content to wait. He turned. His eyes moved across her once. And Flora felt it the way she always felt it. That bracing, that half-second of preparation for the flicker downward, the shift in how they'd decide to speak to her next. His eyes stayed on her face. That was almost worse, because she knew how to handle the other thing. The drop, the pause, the sudden adjustment in how a man decided what she was worth. She had responses for all of it, automatic and armor-plated. But a man who looked at her like she was the most interesting problem in a room full of problems. She had no response built for that. She hadn't thought she'd need one. One of the flanking men moved toward her. The man at the window raised one hand. They stopped. Miss Jameson. His English was precise, unhurried. You're early. The memo said 9. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. It's 9. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness. He didn't look like a man who kept softness accessible. An adjustment. Small. Internal. Not meant to be seen. She saw it. Sit down. I'd prefer to stand. The flanking men exchanged a look. The man in the chair made a sound that might have been a laugh if his mouth weren't swollen. Ahn Manwol looked at her for a long moment without blinking. Sit down, Miss Jameson. Same tone, same pace. Please. She sat. 40 minutes of questions. Not from him. He stayed at the window watching the city, occasionally watching her reflection in the glass. His men asked what she'd seen, what she knew, who had sent her. She told the truth about VP Choi's memo because lying about something verifiable was the fastest way to lose the only currency she had in this room. When it was over, Manuel turned from the window. "She stays on this floor," to his men, not to her. "Restricted access, full monitoring. Sir, until I decide otherwise. You're keeping me here." She said it directly to him. "For now that is the same as keeping you safe." No pause, no softness, just fact. She held his gaze. He returned it without performance, without the dominance display most powerful men couldn't resist. Steady, certain, like he'd already run the calculation and was simply waiting for her to arrive at the same answer. "Why does a man like this look at me like he was expecting me?" She didn't ask. She filed it. They put her in a side office with a glass wall facing the door, surveillance dressed as hospitality. She set her bag down, sat, and looked at her, hands until they stopped trembling. Through the glass, Manuel spoke quietly to his underboss. The underboss glanced at her once. The look on his face was not welcoming. Someone in this building had wanted her here. She was no longer certain it was VP Choi.
He had approved her hire 14 months ago. He hadn't known her name then, hadn't needed to. The file had crossed his desk the way all Shin Group appointments did. Photograph, credentials, background check, risk assessment. He reviewed them the way he reviewed everything, efficiently, without attachment. He'd signed off on Flora Jameson in under 4 minutes and moved on. He remembered thinking, 6 months, maybe less. Not cruelty, calculation. Foreign nationals on dependent visas rarely survived the internal politics of Shin Group's administrative floor. The environment was designed, not officially, never officially, to exhaust people who didn't fit the preferred profile until they resigned quietly and saved everyone the paperwork. She had lasted every single one of the 14 months since. He found himself looking at that number longer than was necessary. His underboss, Rio, was speaking. Manuel heard every word and processed none of them. He was watching Flora through the glass wall of the side office he'd put her in. Surveillance dressed as hospitality, which he had identified immediately. He could tell by the way she'd looked at the glass before she sat down. Measured it, accepted it, filed it away. She doesn't panic, he thought. She catalogues. Liability from the moment she walked through that door, Rio was saying. She saw back in the chair. She saw the operation. Protocol is clear. Protocol. Manuel said the word the way he said most words, flatly, without inflection, leaving the other person to determine whether it was agreement or dismissal. Rio paused. Sir, VP Choi signed the reassignment memo. Yes. To this floor. Tonight. Yes. Manuel let the silence sit. Through the glass, Flora had set her bag on the desk and was looking at her hands. He watched her make them stop trembling through what appeared to be pure will. No deep breath, no closing of eyes. Just a decision. Executed. Who trained? You, he thought. And for what? Choi doesn't make moves without a purpose, he said finally. He sent her here as bait. Rio's expression didn't change. Then we remove the bait. We keep the bait. Manuel turned from the glass. And we find out what he's fishing for. Rio's expression still didn't change. That was the thing about Rio. It never did. Manuel had once considered that a virtue. He went back to his desk and opened her full file. The photograph was standard issue, corporate ID, Flat lighting, the kind of image designed to reduce a person to their clearance level. It had mostly worked 14 months ago. He'd seen female, foreign national, administrative grade, low risk. He looked at it now and understood he had seen nothing at all. Flora Jameson, 28, Nigerian American. Lagos, then London, then Seoul. A trajectory that didn't happen by accident. Her credentials were meticulous. Her performance reviews were flawless despite the fact that he could read between the lines of corporate language well enough to know she'd been undermined consistently, blamed for errors above her pay grade, mocked in ways that never made it into official documentation. She had absorbed all of it, kept her numbers clean, and funded her mother's medical treatment from a salary that barely covered both. Manwall closed the file. He felt something he didn't name, didn't examine. Buried it the way he buried everything that didn't serve an immediate operational purpose and moved on. He thought about the moment she'd walked through the door. He'd heard the handle turn and kept his back to the room because whoever it was would reveal more in the first 3 seconds if they didn't know they were being assessed. He'd turned expecting one of Choi's lower operatives, someone nervous, someone he could read in under a minute and dismiss in under 2. She had been standing there with her hand on the door and her face completely, almost unnervingly, still. His eyes had moved across her, and something had happened that he was not going to examine closely. Something that required immediate containment. He had contained it. He was practiced at containing things. What he had not expected was for her to see him do it. Most people miss that. Most people were too busy managing their own fear to notice the small adjustments of the person assessing them. Flora had noticed. He'd watched her notice and then watched her choose not to react, filing it away the same way she filed everything, quietly, precisely, for later use. She's going to be a problem, he'd thought. He hadn't meant it as a warning. Rio appeared in the doorway. I'd like to request a meeting, tomorrow, regarding the woman. Manwall looked up. In 11 years, Rio had never requested a meeting. He raised concerns. He delivered reports. He executed instructions. He did not request. Bring it to me directly, now. Tomorrow is better. A pause so brief most people would have missed it. Sir. Manwall held his gaze for a moment, then looked back down at the file. Tomorrow then. Manwall said it without looking up, as if it didn't matter either way. Rio left. Manwall looked at the photograph one last time. Flat lighting, corporate reduction. Everything it had missed. 6 months, maybe less, he'd thought 14 months ago. He pulled a separate folder from his drawer, slid her file inside. The folder was not labeled. It went into the drawer that locked. She had lasted every single one of those 14 months. He didn't examine what that meant. He locked the drawer. Hi fam, enjoying this story? You're welcome to subscribe for more. Thanks for listening.
By the 3rd day, she had mapped the floor, not with paper, not with anything they could find if they searched her bag, which they had twice, with the particular thoroughness of men who wanted her to know they'd done it. She'd mapped it the way her mother had taught her to map every new environment, with her eyes, her ears, the pressure of a room when someone entered it versus when someone left. 43rd floor, 9 offices, 2 exits she was permitted, 1 she wasn't. She knew which one mattered. The staff had opinions about her. She'd understood that from the first morning when she'd walked into the small kitchen to make coffee, and the 2 women already there had switched languages mid-sentence. Not to English, she understood enough Korean to follow basic conversation and they knew it. So they went somewhere else entirely, something regional, something that said this conversation is not for you in a dialect she couldn't follow. She'd made her coffee and left, and filed it. The men were less subtle. There was one, junior operations, broad shoulders, the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone he respected, who had taken to walking too close when he passed her in the corridor. Not touching, just close enough that she had to choose between holding her ground or stepping aside. She held her ground every time. On the third day, he stopped in the middle of the corridor, looked at her slowly from her feet up, and said something to the man beside him that made them both laugh. She didn't need the translation. She had heard every version of that laugh in every language she'd ever lived inside. It was the laugh that said, "Look at all of her." The laugh that thought desire and mockery were the same thing. Flora kept her face where she'd put it, and walked past them both. She felt him before she saw him. That had become a problem. The way her body had developed some involuntary awareness of where Man-Wool was on the floor at any given moment, like barometric pressure, like the air before rain. She didn't examine it. She filed it alongside everything else she couldn't afford to act on. He was standing at the end of the corridor. He had seen it. All of it. The slow look. The laugh. Her walk past. He said nothing. Did nothing. His face was the same still surface it always was. But the junior operations man had apparently developed his own barometric awareness because he straightened immediately, found somewhere else to be, and took his colleague with him. They didn't walk too close to her again. She was processing invoices at her desk, real work, which surprised her. She'd expected to be decorative. When the door opened and Man-Wool set a slim folder on the edge of her desk without stopping. Cross-reference these against the Q3 ledger. Flag any discrepancies. I don't have access to the Q3 ledger. He paused. You do now. He left before she could respond. Flora looked at the folder, then at the door, then back at the folder. Real access, not decorative, not bait positioned at a desk to make someone comfortable. Actual access to actual financial records in a conglomerate that she was becoming increasingly certain ran on 2 sets of books. She opened the folder. 3 hours later, she found the first discrepancy, then 4 more, then a pattern so clean and deliberate it couldn't be accidental. Transfers routed through a subsidiary she'd never heard of, timed precisely against quarterly reporting windows, signed off by a name she recognized. VP Choi. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. She flagged the discrepancies the way he'd asked. She did not flag the pattern. The pattern she memorized and filed in the place inside herself where she kept the things that might one day keep her alive. She was still at her desk at midnight when she realized she hadn't eaten since morning. She went to the kitchen. The floor was quiet, most of the staff gone. Only the low hum of the city through the glass and the particular silence of a building that never fully slept. She was standing at the counter eating cold rice from a container she'd found in the back of the refrigerator when she heard his voice behind her. That's Rio's. She turned. Man-Wool was in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, jacket gone, which was the most undone she had seen him, and somehow made him more formidable rather than less. There was no name on it. There never is. He always forgets. Flora looked at the container, then back at him. I'll replace it. He won't notice. She kept eating. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, which was its own kind of problem. After a moment, he spoke. You found something in the ledger. Not a question. I flagged the discrepancies you asked for. And the ones you didn't flag. Flora set down the container slowly and looked at him. He was watching her with that expression she still had no name for, not softness, not assessment, not the performance of either. the one that made her chest do the thing she had no language for. "I don't know what you mean," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes, you do." He set down his glass and left the kitchen. Flora stood in the silence he left behind and looked out at the city. When she turned to go back to her desk, she saw him, Rio, at the far end of the corridor, still in his suit at midnight, facing the kitchen doorway. He hadn't moved. He hadn't been watching Manuel. He had been watching her.
Rio brought him the task assignment at 7 in the morning. A document run, external. Shin Group's legal subsidiary 3 blocks away. Routine paperwork requiring an administrative signature and a physical handoff. 40 minutes out, 40 minutes back. Standard enough that no one would question it. Manuel read it twice. It wasn't standard. The timing was precise in the way that only mattered if you needed someone in a specific location at a specific time. The legal subsidiary's senior partner had been on leave for 2 weeks. He knew because he knew everything that moved through Shin Group's satellite offices. There was no one there to receive a handoff. It was a trap dressed as an errand. He looked at Rio across the desk. Rio's face was what it always was, still, composed, the face of a man who had spent 11 years making himself indispensable by being unreadable. When did you stop being loyal? He thought. Or were you never? Assign it to Miss Jameson, Rio said. She has external clearance. It keeps her movement looking routine. Every word was correct. Every word was also a test of Manuel, not of Flora. Rio was watching to see if he'd protect her, watching for the gap, the tell, the evidence of whatever he'd decided was happening between them. Manuel initialed the assignment sheet. Send her at 10, he said. He told himself it was operational. He needed to know what she did under pressure without a glass wall between them and safety. He needed to know if she could navigate a situation that turned wrong without his men to extract her. He needed data. He watched the clock move toward 10 and did not examine what he was actually doing. At 9:58, Flora appeared in his doorway. She was in her coat, bag over one shoulder, the document folder tucked under her arm with the particular neatness of someone who treated every task like it might be reviewed later. The legal subsidiary, she said. I'm ready. He looked at her. She looked back. Something in her eyes said she already knew this wasn't routine. The same way she'd known the 43rd floor wasn't routine. The same way she knew the glass wall was surveillance. The same way she knew to keep the ledger pattern to herself. She knew, and she was going anyway. Why? He thought. Be back by noon, he said. She left. He tracked her on the building's external feed for the first 6 minutes, then made himself stop. The next 40 minutes were the longest he had spent at his desk in 11 years of running operations that occasionally required him to send people into situations from which they did not return. He did not examine why these 40 minutes felt different from all of those. He reviewed contracts. He answered 3 calls. He read the same paragraph of a legal brief 4 times without absorbing a single word. At 11:42, she walked back through the floor's main entrance, alone, unhurried. The document, folder still tucked under her arm. He was in his doorway before he'd decided to move. She stopped when she saw him. Read his expression, whatever it was, whatever he'd failed to contain in the 11 seconds between her appearance and his, and something shifted in her face. Not satisfaction. Something quieter. Something that looked almost like the answer to a question she hadn't been sure of until now. The senior partner was on leave, she said. I know. The junior associate who met me instead had no record of the appointment in their system. I know. Someone wanted me in that building with no legitimate contact and no paper trail. She held his gaze. I made a paper trail. He looked at her. I introduced myself to every person in that lobby by name. I asked the receptionist to log my visit. I left my business card with the junior associate and asked them to follow up in writing. She paused. If something had happened to me, there were 7 people who could place me in that building at that time. She reached into the document folder and placed a small USB drive on his desk. This was inside the folder when I opened it at the subsidiary. It wasn't there when Rio handed it to me this morning. The junior associate had stepped out to take a call. She paused. Someone put it there while I wasn't watching the folder. 7 witnesses, he thought, in 40 minutes. Without being told to. He stepped back from the doorway. Come in. She came in. He closed the door. She sat without being asked this time. Not compliance. He understood the difference now, but a choice. She was deciding what this room was on her own terms. He stood at the window, soul below. The city going about its business, 43 floors beneath a room where something was shifting in ways he didn't have operational language for. Rio assigned the task, he said. I know. No hesitation. You knew before you went. I knew it wasn't routine. She set the folder on his desk. I went anyway because refusing would tell him I was warned, and being warned would tell him you told me. She paused. I didn't want to create that problem for you. Manuel looked at the folder on his desk. She had walked into a trap to protect his position, without being asked, without any guarantee that he deserved it. He felt something move through him that refused to be filed or buried or locked in a drawer. He looked at her. She was already looking at him. Neither of them said anything. The silence had weight, not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people aware that whatever they said next would matter. He looked away first. That had never happened before. You can go, he said. She stood, picked up her bag, walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the handle. Rio was watching me leave this morning, she said. Not the elevator. Me. She didn't wait for his response. The door closed behind her and Manuel stood at the window and looked at Seoul and understood that the problem was no longer Rio. The problem was that she had just protected him and he had let her, and some part of him, the part he kept in the locked drawer, had wanted her to.
It had been raining for 3 hours. She could hear it against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Steady, unhurried, the kind of rain that had decided it was staying. The kind that turned Seoul into a smear of light and shadow, 43 floors below, and made the world outside feel very far away, and the world inside feel very small. She was still at her desk at 11 p.m., because going to the side office they'd given her felt like admitting she lived here now. She didn't live here. She was surviving here. There was a difference and she needed to keep knowing what it was. The floor had emptied 2 hours ago. Even Rio was gone. She'd watched him leave from the corner of her eye, noted the direction, filed it. His absence didn't relax her. It made her more careful. Rio absent was its own kind of surveillance. She was reviewing the flagged discrepancies for the 3rd time when she heard his door open. He didn't announce himself. He never did. He simply arrived in a space and the space adjusted around him. She kept her eyes on her screen. He crossed the floor and stopped at the window beside her desk. Not behind her, not hovering, just beside her, looking out at the rain-smeared city with his hands in his pockets, and his jacket still on at 11 p.m., because she had never seen him fully off duty and was beginning to suspect he didn't know how. The silence between them had been changing all week. It had started as the silence of assessment, two people measuring each other across a distance. It had become something else, something that had weight and texture and required management. She was managing it, barely. "You should go to your room," he said. "I'm finishing the review." "You finished it an hour ago." She looked up at him then. He was still looking at the window, at the city, at the rain, at their twin reflections in the glass. She could see his face in the reflection more clearly than she could see it in the room, and something about that felt true. Like the reflection was the version of him that didn't have the controlled surface engaged. In the reflection, he was looking at her, not at the city, not at the rain, at her. She should have looked away. She didn't. "You've been here every night this week," she said. "It's my floor. You have an apartment. I've seen the car arrive in the mornings." Something shifted in his reflected expression. "You've been tracking my movements. You've been tracking mine." She held his reflected gaze. "We're even." The rain pressed against the glass. Soul blurred and glittered below. The space between them, 3 feet of charged air that she had been carefully maintaining all week, felt suddenly insufficient. He turned from the window. She turned from the screen. They were facing each other, and the 3 feet was not 3 feet anymore, and she had not seen him move, but he was closer now, close enough that she could see the thing he kept contained behind. His eyes straining against its own lock. His gaze moved across her, unhurried, deliberate, the way it had that first night when she'd braced for the flicker downward, and it hadn't come. This time, it didn't stay on her face. This time it moved, slowly, with the careful attention of a man giving himself permission for something he'd been refusing for weeks. And when it came back up to her face, something in his expression had changed. The lock was still there, but it was no longer holding. His voice, when it came, was low, almost involuntary. Like something that had been building pressure for so long, it finally found the only exit available. "You're so thick." Flora froze. The words landed the way they always landed, in the place where her grandmother's warmth and London's cruelty and Soul's silence had all accumulated into a single bruise she carried without showing. Every version of those words, from every room she'd ever survived, rose up at once, and her body did what it had learned to do. It prepared to leave. She pushed back from the desk, stood, reached for her bag. He stepped into her path. Not grabbing, not blocking, just suddenly there, his body a quiet barrier between her and the door. Flora. Her name in his mouth was something she was unprepared for. He had called her Miss Jameson for 4 weeks. Her name sounded like something he had been holding carefully and was only now setting down. She stopped. "Look at me." She turned. His face was open in a way she had not seen it. Not vulnerable. She didn't think he had access to vulnerability. Not yet, maybe not ever, but unguarded. The controlled surface was still there, but it had developed cracks, and through the cracks something was coming through that she recognized because she had spent 4 weeks watching him contain it. He wanted her. Not the laugh in the corridor want, not the inventory want, not the want that thought desire and mockery were interchangeable. This was the want of a man who had been paying attention, who had watched her map a floor with her eyes and build 7 witnesses in 40 minutes and eat Rio's cold rice without apology, who had seen her absorb the corridor laugh and keep walking and understood exactly what that cost her. She had no armor left for this. He closed the distance slowly, giving her every opportunity to say no. She didn't. His hands found her waist, both of them, certain and unhurried. And he exhaled like he'd been holding that breath since the night she walked through his door. His forehead dropped to hers, and for a long moment, they simply stood there in the rain light, with Seoul 43 floors below, and the floor empty around them. Then the space between them closed entirely, right there in the rain light, with Seoul below and no walls between them and the rest of the world, except the ones they stopped caring about. What followed was not the corridor laugh. It was not inventory. It was the opposite of every version of thick she had ever had to survive. His hands, his mouth, his attention, all of it saying, "You are not something I am taking." Every touch deliberate, every pause intentional. The worship of someone who had been paying attention for weeks and was now, finally, saying so in the only language his controlled and careful self could fully access. She stopped managing the silence. She let herself be seen. Afterward, the rain was still falling. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and waited for regret to arrive. It didn't. That terrified her.
He woke before she did. That wasn't unusual. He hadn't slept past 5 in 11 years. His body had long ago decided that unconsciousness was a liability and adjusted accordingly. What was unusual was the specific quality of waking. The awareness, before he'd fully surfaced, that something in the room was different, that the air had a different weight, that he was not alone in the way he was normally not alone. Staff, security, the operational presence of people whose job was proximity, but alone in a way that had a name he wasn't going to say. He lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling. The rain had stopped. Seoul was doing what Seoul did at 5 in the morning, glittering on, indifferent, the city's night shift handing over to its day shift, with the seamless continuity of a place that never fully closed its eyes. Flora was asleep. He turned his head and looked at her the way he hadn't allowed himself to look at her while she was awake. Without the controlled surface, without containment, without the operational assessment that he used as a buffer between himself and things he couldn't afford to want. She was on her side, facing away from him. Her breathing was even. She had one hand tucked under her cheek, the way a person sleeps when they feel safe, and he understood that she probably didn't know she'd done it, and that understanding landed somewhere in his chest with a weight he didn't examine. She feels safe, he thought. He didn't know what to do with that. He got up, dressed, moved to the window. The floor was still dark, the city outside still grey-blue with early morning, and he stood where he always stood and looked at Seoul and tried to locate the operational clarity that had governed every decision he'd made for 11 years. It wasn't where he'd left it. He thought about Rio. The USB, the meeting still waiting like a debt he hadn't paid. He thought about none of it for long. Last night had not been operational. He could not file it, or lock it in a drawer, or bury it under the language of strategy. It had been the least strategic thing he had done in 11 years, and he could not locate regret about it, which was its own kind of information. Anyone I get close to becomes a liability or a loss. He had built 11 years of decisions around that single truth. Flora was standing inside all of it, and he had let her in himself. He turned from the window. She was awake. He didn't know when it had happened. She had made no sound, no movement he'd caught, but she was sitting up in the dim light with her knees drawn up and her eyes on him and the composed face in place. The armor, the second skeleton. She'd put it back on while he wasn't looking. Something about that made his chest do the thing he had no operational language for. "You're dressed," she said. "I have an early call." She looked at him for a moment, reading him the way she read everything, quietly, precisely for later use. He watched her find what she was looking for in his expression and watched her file it without reaction. She got up, smoothed her clothes, found her shoes. She was leaving. He knew she was leaving. He had watched enough people leave, had engineered enough departures, had been the reason for enough exits, that he recognized the particular quality of someone moving toward a door with intention. He didn't move. He told himself it was because blocking her exit would be a confession, and he didn't make confessions. He told himself it was operational. Let her go, maintain distance, reduce the gap before Rio could use it. He told himself a great many things. She picked up her bag, crossed the floor, reached the door. His hand moved. It caught her wrist, barely, the tips of his fingers less than a second, and released immediately when she turned to look at him. They stood in the early grey light with the city behind him and the door in front, of her and 11 years of his own careful logic telling him to let her go. She looked at his hand, then at his face. Manuel. His name in her mouth, not a question, not a softness, just his name, said by someone who understood exactly what it contained and was handing it back to him gently. He let her go. The door opened. She stepped through it. She was almost at the elevator when Rio appeared from the corridor junction. He wasn't running. He never ran. He simply materialized the way he always did, as if he had been exactly where he needed to be before anyone understood why. He fell into step beside her at a distance that was professionally acceptable and personally deliberate. "You should take your leave soon, Miss Jameson." His voice was pleasant, conversational, the voice of a man discussing nothing in particular. Extended stays on this floor tend to become complicated. Flora stopped walking. She turned and looked at him, fully, directly, the way she looked at everything she was filing for later use. He met her gaze with the composed stillness of a man who had decided she was already handled and was simply informing her of that fact. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. She turned back to the elevator and pressed the button and stood with her bag over her shoulder and her face where she'd put it until the doors opened. She stepped in. The doors closed. She was already somewhere else entirely. Manuel stood in the space she left behind and looked at his own hand and understood that he had just lost something. Not to death, not to betrayal, the two losses he knew how to process, the two losses he had built his entire operational life around surviving. Something he had let go of himself. That had never happened before. He went to his desk, opened his laptop, sat. The building's internal camera showed the elevator doors closing. He sat at his desk in the early morning light and did not move for a long time. His phone lit up. Rio. Ready for that meeting.
She had 72 hours. Rio had given her the idea himself. Extended stays tend to become complicated. She had turned that sentence over in her mind the entire elevator ride down, and by the time she reached the lobby, she had already decided. She would leave. But not the way he meant. The window was already there. A 3-day administrative leave tied to a compliance audit that required her physical absence from the 43rd floor. She had requested it that morning before any of this. The timing was either luck or something she was going to treat as luck and move on. She used the first hour to find a hotel 4 blocks from Shin Group's financial district office. Cash. A name that wasn't hers. The kind of room that asked no questions because it had learned that questions reduced occupancy. She sat on the bed and opened her laptop and got to work. She had photographed the ledger pattern 3 weeks ago with her phone during the 30 seconds Manuel's office had been empty, a calculated risk she had taken without telling him, because some information was safer held alone until you understood what it was worth and who it was dangerous to. She understood now. VP Choi's transfers were clean on the surface, routed through a subsidiary called Hana Vantage Partners, timed against quarterly windows, signed with rotating authorization codes that changed every 90 days. Someone with a cursory eye would see normal intercompany movement. Flora had a forensic eye, and 14 months of Shin Group's financial language built into her memory. She saw the pattern underneath the pattern. Hana Vantage Partners didn't exist in any corporate registry she could access. The authorization codes rotated on a schedule that matched no internal audit cycle she'd been given access to. The transfers landed in accounts that fed into 3 separate shell structures before disappearing entirely. VP Choi wasn't just skimming. He was running a parallel operation inside Shin Group's books, using Manuel's own financial infrastructure to move money that had nothing to do with Manuel's operation. He's been stealing from the man he's trying to destroy, she thought, using his own house to do it. She kept going. The USB was the part she hadn't told him about. She had plugged it into an isolated device, a cheap laptop she'd bought with cash the morning after the subsidiary trap. And what it contained had kept her awake for 2 nights running. Not because it was complicated, because it was simple. It was her, personnel files, visa documentation, her mother's medical records, the same ones that had appeared on her desk weeks ago, the ones that had told her Manuel knew more about her than she'd given him access to. Photographs taken outside her apartment building before she'd ever been reassigned to the 43rd floor. Someone had been building a file on her long before VP Choi's memo arrived. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she looked at the metadata on the oldest photograph. The date was 14 months ago. The same week Manuel approved her hire. She stopped breathing for a moment. Then she started again, slowly, and made herself think it through, without the feeling attached. 2 possibilities. 1. Manuel had been surveilling her since the beginning. Her hire was never routine. She had been selected for something she still didn't fully understand. 2. Someone else had been building the file on her from the start and had planted it on the USB to make her suspect him. She thought about the reflection in the glass, his hand catching her wrist, the way he'd looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She had been watching. She was always watching. And the thing that had moved across his expression that she had no name for, but recognized because she had felt its twin moving through herself. She thought about the date on his higher approval. He chose me first, she thought. Before the floor, before the night, before any of this. The question was whether that meant he had been watching her for 14 months, or whether it meant something else entirely. She spent the second day pulling every public record attached to Hana Vantage Partners, every filing, every registered address. Dead ends, all of them. The shell was clean, professionally clean. The kind of clean that required either a very good lawyer or a very frightened accountant. She found the accountant, a name buried in a subsidiary filing from 3 years ago. A man who had signed off on Hana Vantage's initial registration and then apparently ceased to exist in any professional capacity afterward. She found him in 40 minutes, using nothing but public databases, and the particular patience of someone who had learned that frightened people left traces because they couldn't afford to disappear completely. He was living in Busan under a name that was almost but not quite different from his original one. She sat with that for a long time before she did anything. A frightened man in hiding was either the most useful person she could contact or the most dangerous. If Rio knew about him, and Rio seemed to know about most things, reaching out could surface her location before she was ready. She sent the email anyway, from an address that couldn't be traced back to her. Short, specific, no threats, no promises she couldn't keep. I know what you signed. I know why you left Seoul. I'm not Choi, and I'm not the man Choi works against. I need one document. In exchange, I can make the thing you're afraid of significantly less dangerous for you. She closed the laptop and waited, knowing he might not reply, knowing he might run, knowing that if she'd miscalculated, she'd just told a frightened man exactly where to point Rio. His reply came at 11 p.m., an attachment, a single page, the original Hana Vantage registration document with a second signatory she hadn't seen in any of the public filings, not VP Choi, Rio. Flora sat in the hotel room with the city outside the window and looked at the name and understood that she had been wrong about the shape of the threat. VP Choi was not running a parallel operation against Manwol. Rio was. Choi was just the instrument. She closed the laptop, sat in the dark, thought about a man at a window at 5 a.m. who couldn't locate his operational clarity and didn't know his most trusted person had been dismantling everything he'd built from the inside. She picked up her phone. She put it back down. Not yet, she thought, not until it's enough to be untouchable. She had one more day. She walked back into Shin Group at 9 a.m. on the third day. Not through the side entrance, not quietly. Through the main lobby, past security, past the reception desk where two people looked up and said nothing, because she had learned that the way you entered a building was a message, and she had chosen hers carefully. She had 3 things in her bag: a printed copy of the Hana Vantage registration document with Rio's signature, a USB containing the full ledger pattern, Choi's transfers, Rio's shell structures, 3 years of a parallel operation running through Manwol's own financial infrastructure, and a signed statement from the accountant in Busan, witnessed and notarized, that she had arranged remotely the night before using the last of her 72 hours. She was untouchable. She got in the elevator and pressed 43.
He knew she was in the building before she reached the floor. He'd been tracking the lobby feed since 7, not continuously, he told himself, just periodically. And when she appeared on the screen, he sat forward in his chair and stayed there. She was walking differently. Not the composed walk he'd catalogued over 14 months, armor in place, temperature set, giving them nothing. This was something else, something that didn't need the armor because it had moved past the point where the armor was the first line of defense. She went somewhere, he thought, and she came back different. His door opened before she knocked. He'd been standing at it.
He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. She filed that without reacting and walked past him into his office and set all 3 items on his desk in a clean row. He looked at them, then at her. Rio, she said. Not Choi. Choi is the instrument. Rio has been running a parallel operation through your infrastructure for 3 years. The accountant who registered Hana Vantage is in Busan. His statement is notarized. The ledger pattern is complete and sourced. She paused. I have copies in 3 locations that will reach a financial crimes unit automatically if I don't check in every 48 hours. Manwol looked at the documents for a long moment. You did this in 72 hours. I did this in 72 hours. He picked up the registration document, read it, set it down. His face was the still surface it always was, but something underneath it was moving. She could see it the way she'd learned to see everything about him, through the reflection rather than the surface. He targeted you, Manuel said, because you were already dangerous, not because of what you saw, because of what you were capable of finding. I know. She held his gaze. I found it.
He picked up his phone and sent one message. 30 seconds later, the door opened. Rio. Manuel watched him take in the room. Flora standing at the desk, the documents laid out, Manuel's expression, and watched him make the calculation that took most people 30 seconds in under 3. Rio had always been fast. Sir, Rio said. The voice was what it always was, composed, unreadable. 11 years of practiced stillness that Manuel now understood had never been loyalty, it had been camouflage. The accountant in Busan sends his regards, Flora said without turning around. Something moved across Rio's face, the first uncontrolled thing Manuel had ever seen from him. Gone in under a second, but it had been there. Manuel crossed the room. He stopped in front of Rio and looked at the man he had trusted for 11 years with the particular attention of someone finally seeing a thing clearly after a very long time of choosing not to. Get him out, he said to the Oizas, 2 men who had appeared in the doorway behind Rio. Quietly. Rio didn't resist. That was almost worse. The composure of a man who had already calculated his next move and was simply moving to it. At the door, he paused. She's still a liability, he said. To Manuel, not to Flora. Whatever you think this is. Leave, Manuel said. Rio left.
The room was quiet. She became aware that her hands were trembling, not from fear. The fear had burned off somewhere around the second day in the hotel room, from the release of something she'd been holding at full tension for 72 hours. She didn't hide it this time. Manuel crossed back to her. He stopped close, the same distance as the night of the rain, the same charge in the air, but different in quality. That night had been restraint finally breaking. This was something that had moved past restraint entirely into something that didn't have a lock on it. He looked at her hands, then at her face. He cupped her face in both hands, slow, deliberate, the way he did everything. And she felt the steadiness of him move into her through his palms, and her hands stopped trembling. You came back, he said. I came back for me. She held his gaze. You're part of what I chose. Something broke open in his expression. Not vulnerability. She still didn't think he had full access to that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the space where the lock had been. Empty now. Open. His forehead came down to hers. Then stay, he said. Not on this floor. Not under surveillance. A pause. Stay because you choose to. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had approved her hire 14 months ago, who had looked at her reflection instead of her face, who had let her walk out a door and then stood at a window and not moved for a very long time, who had seen her, all of her, and had not looked away. I'll think about it, she said. His mouth curved, the smallest thing, the first time she had seen it. That's enough, he said, for now. Outside, Seoul went about its business 43 floors below. Indifferent, relentless, the city that never fully closed its eyes. Inside, Flora Jameson stood in a room she had walked into as a witness and walked out of as something entirely her own. That didn't terrify her at all. And we've come to the end of it, besties. Thank you for spending your time here. I appreciate